Hello, welcome to OJ Studios. Please enjoy today's chapter of Ghost by Olivia Julius. You don't wake up when you die. That's the first thing they don't tell you. There's no burst of light, no celestial music, no gates to be judged before. For me, it was more like a stumble. 1 second, I was walking down the street, earbuds in, a playlist of songs I'd heard too many times before keeping me distracted. The next second, there was this sharp, sudden jolt, like the world had hiccuped, and I was on the ground. I don't even remember hearing a gunshot. No angry shouting. Nothing. Just this weird pressure in my chest and the sensation of falling, even though I hadn't tripped. I remember looking down and seeing blood, so much blood, soaking through my favorite hoodie, pooling on the cracked sidewalk beneath me. Then everything went blurry. My head spun, my ears rang, and my body felt like it weighed 1,000,000 pounds. And then, nothing. Well, not quite nothing. I'm not sure how long I stayed there in the nothingness. It wasn't black, it wasn't white, it wasn't anything. Just this heavy, soundless void that pressed in from all directions. It felt like hours, maybe days. Long enough for me to start wondering if this was it. If death was just floating in empty silence for eternity. But then, suddenly, I was back. Kind of. The first thing I noticed was that it was nighttime. The sky was clear, the stars sharp pinpricks above the city. I was still on the sidewalk, but something was wrong. The blood, my blood, was gone. The people who had walked by without noticing before were still walking by now, but their faces were fuzzy, out of focus. It was like watching a video with the brightness turned down and the sharpness cranked all the way up. I stood up. Or at least I thought I did. It wasn't like standing in the usual way, where your legs push you off the ground. It was more like I willed myself upright and my body followed. My hands moved to my chest instinctively, and that's when I saw it, the hole. Right where my heart should have been, there was a jagged, dark void. Not blood, not flesh, just this swirling emptiness, like a black hole punched straight through me. I should have screamed. I should have panicked. But I didn't. I just stood there, staring at it, feeling numb. People walked past me, completely oblivious. A couple laughed as they passed, their voices muffled, as though they were underwater. A man in a suit muttered into his phone, a briefcase swinging at his side. Nobody looked down at the spot where I'd been lying, where the blood should have been staining the concrete. Nobody looked at me. I reached out to grab the arm of the man with the briefcase, to ask him what the hell was going on. My hand passed right through him, like he was made of smoke. Or maybe I was. That's when it hit me. I was dead. It wasn't some wild leap of logic. It was just a fact, solid and undeniable, like the weight of gravity or the way the air feels before a storm. I was 20 years old, walking home after a crappy shift at a diner, and someone I hadn't even seen, had taken it all away from me. But why? Why me? I wasn't rich. I didn't have enemies. Hell, the most illegal thing I'd ever done was sneak into an R-rated movie when I was 16. What reason could anyone have to kill me? The questions came in a rush, piling on top of each other until my head was spinning. And then another thought broke through, sharp and cold, they're still out there. Whoever did this to me, whoever left me bleeding out on a dirty sidewalk like my life didn't matter, they were still walking around, breathing, living their life like nothing happened. And I couldn't do anything about it. All I could do was stand there, staring at the spot where my life ended, and wonder what the hell I was supposed to do next. I didn't have to stand there long before the chaos arrived. A flash of red and blue lights reflected off the storefront windows, and the shrill wail of sirens grew louder as a police car screeched to a halt nearby. Paramedics followed moments later, leaping out of their vehicle with grim faces and practiced efficiency. The scene was no longer invisible, at least, not to them. They taped off the sidewalk with that familiar bright yellow line that screamed, "Crime scene." Onlookers gathered at a safe distance, their faces blurred like the others. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their gestures told me enough, pointing, whispering, shaking their heads in quiet disbelief. And then I saw myself. It was a surreal kind of horror, like staring at a wax figure of your own face. My body lay crumpled on the pavement, my hoodie soaked through with blood that had started to dry. The paramedics knelt down beside me, checking for signs of life they wouldn't find. One of them, a man with dark, tired eyes and a close-cropped beard, sighed as he took my pulse. "Nothing," he muttered, shaking his head. I leaned closer, instinctively, like somehow hearing it again would make it more real. It didn't. It just made the numbness creep deeper into my chest, the emptiness where my heart used to be yawning wider. I leaned closer still, until my face was almost level with his. And then something happened.
There wasn't a jolt or a flash of light, nothing dramatic like in the movies. It was more like sliding into a warm pool, or putting on a jacket that fits just right. I didn't realize what had happened at first. Everything just shifted, the world snapping into focus like someone had turned a lens. The blurred faces of the crowd sharpened. The sound of distant traffic roared back to life. I blinked. And then I noticed the weight. The heaviness of a body, not my body. Gloves stretched over my hands. A penlight dangled from my front pocket, brushing against the stethoscope I hadn't been wearing a second ago. "What the hell?" I muttered, except it wasn't my voice. It was his. I glanced down, catching sight of my reflection in a side mirror on the ambulance. Staring back at me was the paramedic, the tired-eyed man who'd been leaning over my body just seconds ago. His lips moved when I spoke. His chest rose and fell when I breathed. I had no idea how, but I was inside him. I wasn't just near him, I was him. For a moment I froze, paralyzed by the impossibility of it all. But the moment didn't last. The other paramedic, a wiry woman with sharp eyes and a ponytail, called out, "Sam? You good?" Sam. That must have been his name. My name? I didn't even know how to answer. My borrowed mouth opened and closed uselessly. "Yeah," I finally said, forcing the words out. "I'm fine." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press, returning to the task at hand. Meanwhile, I stood there, trying to make sense of what I'd just done. I didn't know much, but one thing was clear: I wasn't helpless. I couldn't change what had happened to me, but maybe, just maybe, I could use this. Whoever killed me was still out there, walking free. And now I had a way to find them. I didn't know how I'd gotten into the paramedic's body, but I knew one thing: I needed out. The sensation of being someone else, of moving in a body that wasn't mine, was all wrong. It was like wearing clothes 2 sizes too big and too tight at the same time. I stood there awkwardly, feeling the weight of Sam's limbs, the subtle itch of stubble on my jaw, the strange rhythm of his breathing that wasn't quite mine. My hands fumbled at my sides, and I tried to think my way out of this. "Come on," I muttered, clenching his fists. "You got in. You can get out." I focused on pulling back, on peeling away from his body, like slipping off a pair of gloves. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden lurch,
I was yanked out of him. The world blurred and twisted, and when it snapped back into focus, I was floating just behind him, watching as Sam stumbled, clutching his head like he'd just woken from a strange dream. "Sam, you good?" the other paramedic asked again, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Yeah," he said, shaking it off. "Just dizzy for a second. I'm fine." He didn't remember. At least, it didn't seem like it. I stayed back, watching as he knelt beside my body again, sealing it in a bag with quiet, grim efficiency. Then, more lights. Blue and white this time. The NYPD had arrived. A squad car pulled up to the curb, and 2 officers stepped out. One of them was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and a face that looked like it belonged on a recruitment poster. The other was a woman, young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun under her cap. Her uniform was crisp, her movements sharp and purposeful. She looked like she had something to prove. I hovered near the tape, watching as they approached the scene. The male officer spoke with the paramedics, but the woman, her name tag read Carter, bent down to examine my body. Her brow furrowed as she studied the blood stain on my hoodie, her gloved hands carefully taking in every detail. I felt drawn to her, like a current pulling me closer. I didn't mean to move closer, but I did. I leaned over her shoulder, peering at the scene through her eyes. And then it happened again.
It was smoother this time, like slipping through an open door. One moment, I was hovering behind her, and the next, I was her. Except this time, it hit me differently. I wasn't just disoriented, I was downright weirded out. My body felt wrong. My center of gravity was off, my limbs felt thinner, and there was this unsettling lightness to my movements. And then there were the other differences. I glanced down, realizing with a start that I was looking at her uniformed chest. Her chest. I almost jumped out of my own skin, or hers. What the hell, I muttered, her voice sharp and unfamiliar in my ears. Carter? The other officer, buzz cut, was staring at me now, his eyebrows raised. Yeah, I said quickly, straightening up. My movements were awkward, stilted, like I didn't know how to move her body properly. Just thinking. He gave me a strange look but didn't press, turning back to the paramedics. I exhaled shakily, trying to focus. This was a lot to process. I was dead. I was a ghost. And now I was stuck in the body of a woman, a cop, no less. And let me tell you, being in a woman's body was strange. I mean, I never really thought about what it felt like to be in a woman's skin before. Everything was different. My hands were smaller, my frame lighter, my center of balance completely off. Even the way I stood felt foreign. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. Carter's partner was calling her and me over, and I had to play along. Coming, I said, her voice still throwing me off. I stepped forward, trying to act normal, trying not to trip over the unfamiliar body I was now piloting. The male officer, his badge read Daniels, motioned me closer, clearly expecting Carter to be on top of things. I walked toward him, trying to get used to the unfamiliar rhythm of her stride, the slightly different center of gravity. I had no idea how long I could keep up the act, but for now, I had no choice. Daniels pointed toward the taped-off section of the sidewalk, where my lifeless body had been zipped into a black bag and loaded into the back of the ambulance. He spoke without looking at me, his tone calm but detached, like he'd done this 100 times before. Looks like a random mugging, he said, squatting to get a closer look at the bloodstain on the ground. No witnesses. No camera coverage on this street. Perps long gone. I froze for a second, trying to process what he just said. Random mugging? My mind reeled. I didn't even have my wallet out, and nothing about this screamed mugging. My hoodie and jeans weren't screaming steal me, and the whole thing felt too sudden, too precise. You're sure it was random? I asked, her voice still catching me off guard. I tried to inject as much skepticism into the question as I could without tipping Daniels off. He shrugged, glancing up at me. Most likely. Happens all the time in neighborhoods like this. They see an easy target walking home alone, take what they can, and bolt. This one just ended worse than usual. I clenched Carter's fists at my sides, feeling her nails dig into her palms. An easy target? That's all I was to this guy? Just another name on a growing list of statistics? But there's no evidence it was a mugging, I countered. The victim, I almost said, I still had his phone and wallet on him, right? And there's no sign of a struggle. Daniel sighed and stood up, brushing imaginary dirt off his knees. Look, Carter. I get it. You're new, still want to crack every case wide open. But I've been doing this a lot longer than you have. Sometimes, it's just random. People die for no reason, and there's not much we can do about it. Her jaw tightened. So what? We just give up? Daniels gave me a look that said I was being naive. We'll write up the report, check for prints, but you know how this goes. No witnesses, no leads. Odds are, this one'll go cold. Can't waste resources chasing ghosts. Ghosts. If I'd been in my own body, I might have punched him. I wanted to scream that I wasn't just some statistic, that I wasn't going to be forgotten. But I couldn't do that. Not yet. I had to stay in control. Right, I said through gritted teeth. Got it. Daniels gave me an approving nod and turned back to the scene, leaving me standing there with her hands clenched into fists. I was furious. Furious at him for brushing me off, at the killer for what they'd done, and at myself for not being able to stop it. But more than that, I was determined. If Daniels and the rest of the NYPD weren't going to take this seriously, I'd find another way. I didn't know how I'd do it, or how long it would take. But whoever killed me wasn't going to get away with it. Not if I had anything to say about it. I was done with the scene. Done with Daniel's indifferent attitude, done with watching people treat my death like just another unsolvable tragedy. I needed to get away, to think, to breathe, even though I didn't need to breathe anymore.
Focusing on Carter's body, I willed myself out, the same way I'd done with Sam. This time, it was easier. With a strange, pulling sensation, I slipped free, my ghostly form untethered once again. Carter wobbled slightly as I left, blinking like she was trying to shake off a dizzy spell. Without looking back, I floated away from the scene, gliding through the cold night air like a breeze no one could feel. My thoughts were a mess, swirling with anger, confusion, and desperation. I didn't know where I was going at first, just that I needed to move. Somehow, I found myself drifting down into the subway. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was because it was where I would have gone if I were still alive. Either way, I slipped through the turnstiles like a shadow and floated along the dimly lit platform. The screech of a train's brakes echoed down the tunnel as it pulled into the station. Commuters shuffled forward, tired faces lit by the harsh fluorescent lights. I scanned the crowd, searching for something, or someone. Then I saw him. He was around my age, maybe a little older, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and earbuds tucked into his ears. He was heading for the downtown line, the same line I would have taken home if my life hadn't been ripped away. Determined, I followed him. The train doors hissed open, and the crowd pressed inside, jostling for space. I stayed close to him, waiting for the right moment. When he grabbed a pole and leaned against it, I moved in.
Possessing him was like slipping into a familiar rhythm. The resistance was barely there, like he wasn't paying attention to himself. And suddenly, I was in. His body felt different, broader than Carter's, but not as heavy as Sam's. His backpack tugged at one shoulder, and the faint thrum of music from his earbuds buzzed faintly in my ears. I looked down at his hands, clenching them into fists and flexing them experimentally. They responded like they were mine. Perfect. I adjusted his grip on the pole and scanned the train. It was crowded but quiet, the low hum of conversation mingling with the sound of the subway wheels screeching against the rails. I let his gaze settle on the windows, watching the dim lights of the tunnel streak past. The man I was now riding in had no idea I was here. His thoughts floated somewhere in the background, faint and fuzzy, like a half-remembered dream. He was just along for the ride, and I was getting home. I didn't know why it mattered so much. Maybe I was grasping for something familiar, something that felt normal. But I was determined to walk through that door again, to see my apartment one last time. Maybe I'd find a clue. Maybe I'd find closure. Or maybe I just needed to feel like I hadn't been erased. The train slowed as it approached the next station. I stayed put, gripping the pole and waiting for my stop. One way or another, I was going to make it back. When the train pulled into my station, I slipped out of the guy's body with a strange, weightless tug.
He blinked, confused, as though he'd zoned out for a second too long. I didn't stick around to see his reaction. Instead, I floated out of the subway, weaving through the crowd of late-night commuters who couldn't see or feel me. The city above was quieter now, the streets damp from a recent drizzle, the glow of streetlights reflecting on the pavement. It all felt surreal, like I was watching my own life play out from the sidelines. I knew the route to my apartment by heart. I didn't even have to think about where to go, my body, or whatever was left of it, just moved on instinct. Block by block, I drifted through the familiar streets, my mind starting to wander. As I moved, a heavy sadness began to settle over me. It wasn't just the anger or confusion anymore, it was regret. I'd spent so much of my life thinking I had time. Time to meet someone. Time to settle down. Time to figure out who I wanted to be. I'd told myself I didn't need anyone else, that being alone was easier. No one to disappoint. No one to lose. But now, all I could think about was how empty my life had been. No wife. No kids. Not even a pet waiting for me at home. Just an empty apartment, a stack of unopened mail, and a fridge filled with takeout leftovers. I used to think I'd have time to change that. Now, I don't have time for anything. The thought stuck with me as I reached my apartment building. The familiar brick facade loomed above me, and I hesitated at the front door. What now? I reached for the handle out of habit, and my hand passed straight through it. I froze for a second, staring at my translucent fingers. Then I took a deep breath, though it was more out of instinct than necessity, and stepped forward. I went straight through the door. It felt strange, like walking into cool water without the resistance. No pressure, no weight, just an odd tingling sensation as I passed through the solid wood. On the other side, I blinked, realizing I was standing in the familiar, dimly lit lobby of my building. I tested it again with the stairwell door. Same thing. No resistance. Guess that's one perk of being dead, I muttered bitterly, my voice echoing faintly in the empty space. I made my way up the stairs, passing through each door like it wasn't even there. It was unnerving, but at the same time, it felt natural. Like this was what I was supposed to be able to do now. When I reached my apartment door, I hesitated. It wasn't locked, not that it mattered, but something about stepping into my own space felt final, like crossing a line I couldn't come back from. Finally, I stepped through, the tingle of the door fading as I entered. The apartment was just as I'd left it. The living room was small and cluttered, the couch still draped with a throw blanket I'd kicked off the night before. My work bag sat by the door, and an empty coffee mug rested on the counter. Everything was still, untouched, like the world hadn't realized I was gone yet. The sight of it all hit me like a punch to the chest. This was my life. And now it was over. I floated there, staring at the place that had once been my home, and felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. The silence was deafening, the regret sharper than any knife. I didn't want to be here. But at the same time, I didn't want to leave. This was all I had left, a collection of things that didn't matter anymore. I sank down onto the couch, or tried to. My form passed right through it, leaving me hovering awkwardly above the cushions. With nothing else to do, I drifted to the window and stared out at the city, the lights twinkling in the distance like they always had. Somewhere out there was the person who'd killed me, living their life like nothing had happened. And here I was, stuck in the ruins of mine. The night passed slowly. I drifted around my apartment, trying to make sense of what my life, or whatever this was, had become. It wasn't like I could sleep. Ghosts don't get tired, apparently. No hunger, no thirst. Just this endless, hollow awareness. At first, I stayed by the window, watching the city lights. Cars buzzed by on the street below, their headlights slicing through the dark. A couple argued on the sidewalk, their voices muffled through the glass. Life was moving on, indifferent to the fact that I wasn't part of it anymore. It was strange how normal everything looked. My apartment hadn't changed in the hours since I'd died. There were the same half-dead houseplants by the window. The same jacket I'd meant to hang up 3 days ago still draped over the back of a chair. Even the faint smell of takeout still clung to the air. I found myself pacing, or whatever the ghostly equivalent of pacing was. My feet didn't make a sound, and I didn't leave any marks on the floor, but the restless feeling was the same. At one point, I wandered into the bedroom. The bed was unmade, the covers a tangled mess from when I'd thrown them off that morning. It felt like a lifetime ago, though I guess, in a way, it was. I sank down, or tried to, but the bed didn't support me. My form just hovered a few inches above the mattress, and it made me feel even less human. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying not to think about how empty it all felt. Eventually, I wandered back to the living room. I tried to touch things, to pick up a coffee mug, to flip through the stack of mail on the counter, but my hands passed through everything. It was like I wasn't even there. I stood in front of the TV for a while, staring at my own reflection in the dark screen. My ghostly form was faint, more like a shadow than anything else, but it was still me. My face. My eyes. The hole in my chest, dark and swirling, was a constant reminder of what I'd lost. The hours dragged on. I didn't have a phone to check the time, but I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me. Outside, the sounds of the city grew quieter. The cars faded. The streets emptied. I sat by the window as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the city in shades of orange and gold. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think about was how I wasn't part of it anymore. The world was still turning. People were waking up, starting their days, living their lives. And I was stuck here, a ghost in an empty apartment.